Hi, everyone. Welcome to the Hammer Museum. I'm Claudia Bester. I'm the Director of Public Programs, and I'm very, very pleased to welcome you to today's talk by art historian John Walsh. Today is part 2 of a series of 4 talks in which Walsh will discuss the work and ideas of the Dutch painter Piet Mondrian. John Walsh is a renowned independent art historian. He was the director of the J. Paul Getty Museum from 1983 until 2000. After graduating from Yale and getting his PhD from Columbia, Walsh worked as a curator at the Metropolitan Museum in New York and the Museum of Fine Arts in Boston, and taught art history at Columbia and Harvard. Since he left the Getty, he's been teaching part-time at Yale and giving public lectures there. And as you will soon see, he's one of the greatest public speakers that I've ever had the privilege of hearing talk. He gave an eye-opening series of lectures on Vincent van Gogh here at the Hammer in 2019, and another series on Rembrandt in 2020. And those lectures are all available on the Hammer website, and I highly recommend watching those as well. Also, part 1 of the Mondrian series is now up on the Hammer website, and it's fantastic, so I recommend checking that out. Walsh is the author of many articles and catalogs on Dutch painting of the 17th century and of several books, including Jan Steen, The Drawing Lesson, and the J. Paul Getty Museum and its collections, a museum for the new century. He currently serves on the boards of the Yale University Art Gallery and of the Hammer Museum. Each of Walsh's 4 talks will focus on the evolution of Mondrian's ideas and theories from figurative painting to abstraction as they developed throughout his life. Next week, on October 15th, Walsh will talk about Mondrian's further experiments with formats and compositions, clarifying them and reducing them to the fewest elements. And today he'll talk about Mondrian's experiments in Cubism. I'd like to invite you all back next Sunday, and then that will be followed by part 4 on October 29th. After today's talk, we'd love for you to join us for coffee, tea, and cookies in the theater lobby where we can continue the discussion. And now, without further ado, please join me in welcoming the one and only John Walsh.
Thanks, Claudia. Hello, everybody. Today, we're going to move on from the first lecture in which we looked at Mondrian's early years in Holland, where he was a talented landscape painter and had a solid academic training. And then for 10 years or so, he played it safe, very much to the taste of the conservative late 19th century art market in Amsterdam. His subjects were usually local, and he had to paint lesser subjects like portraits and still lifes to make a living, but barely. His oil sketches of landscapes like this are brushy and fresh and confident. He pedaled out into the polders all around Amsterdam to paint, and when he reached his early 30s, he was composing scenes along the rivers that often had a severe frontal composition, like the one at the bottom, and sometimes a kind of mysterious atmosphere. Along with other Dutch artists and writers, Mondrian had been studying the esoteric teachings of theosophy. It's a blend of Neoplatonism and Stoicism and Buddhism and Christianity, which strengthened his purpose as an artist for him, which was to make work that would represent the elemental in nature, not just the appearances. So we tried out some radically simple compositions like this, pushing color contrasts and influenced, of course, by some French contemporary painters, using loose brushwork. He was doing all this while living in a new studio in Amsterdam and getting respectful attention from some critics and other artists. A visit to Zeeland on the coast led to more summer trips and more daring experiments with the unfamiliar, isolated motifs and colors and light. Cubism arrived from Paris to Amsterdam in exhibitions, and Mondrian responded with experiments in black and gray, putting on thick brushstrokes between the branches as well as the sky and the ground, reducing any illusion of space. He went to Paris to see for himself, and he spent 2.5 years among the avant-garde. His style evolved toward his own kind of Cubism, based on tree forms and building facades. He wrote later on, "More and more I excluded from my painting all curved lines, until finally my compositions consisted only of vertical and horizontal lines, which formed crosses, each one separate and detached from the other. Observing the sea and sky and stars, I sought to indicate their form-giving function through a multiplicity of crossing verticals and horizontals." Well, we'd reached this point in the first lecture. In 1914, after spending 2 formative years in Paris, he returned to Holland to visit his family, but when the war broke out, Mondrian got stuck there, and he couldn't get back to Paris for 5 years until 1919. In Holland, he boarded with families and worked in relative solitude in various borrowed studios in the town of Laren, which is 25 miles east of Amsterdam, and he went down to Zeeland in the summers and worked there. The town of Laren was a kind of civilized exurb with amenities like this little inn at the top where he went to drink and eat and dance quite regularly. He was not a recluse. In fact, there was plenty of educated people, philosophers, composers, painters, and writers in Laren, some of whom sharpened Mondrian's ideas about his own work. In 1915, he met a young critic and painter, Theo van Doesburg. Doesburg had seen one of the several versions of this composition of sea and a pier in an exhibition, and he wrote a review that this painting stirred in him associations of pure spirituality. The impression is one of calm, the stillness of the soul. Well, that is exactly what Mondrian was after. The year before, he had written this to a friendly critic, Henk Bremmer, at the bottom. "Nature, or that which I see, inspires me. It provides me, as it does every painter, with the emotion by which I am moved to create something." Mondrian believed that the job as a modern painter was not to picture things in nature, but it was to make abstract images that embodied his response to them. The more paintings resemble actual things in the world, Mondrian would add, the less they can convey of their essential nature and his emotional experience of them. Well, Bremmer had said in a lecture in Amsterdam that this picture by Mondrian lived and breathed the clear, pure atmosphere of Christmas Eve. Afterward, people said Bremmer is off the mark a little bit. Was he actually seeing a picture of pine trees in the snow? But Mondrian wrote to Bremmer to support him. It didn't really matter what it portrayed in the usual sense of representation, and you were quite right in saying that my picture had a Christmas Eve atmosphere. If you portray the idea of Christmas in a truly abstract way, then you're expressing stillness, equilibrium, the dominion of the spiritual, and so forth. That is undoubtedly what you intended to say. So Mondrian wrote that tactful, generous line at the beginning of 3 years of experiment. His output of paintings, though, was pretty meager. Instead, he struggled to explain in print what his art was meant to do. He was encouraged by Doesburg, who was younger and energetic and far more worldly and professionally on the make. They exchanged letters, and occasionally they got together in Laren. Doesburg was not a great painter, but he got a lot more serious under Mondrian's influence, and he was a talented organizer and publicist. The painter on the right, here, Bart van der Lek, was also important for Mondrian's art at this stage. He and van der Lek had been friends before Mondrian's stay in Paris, and they saw things with a spiritual bent and, well, a kind of leftward political inclination. They exchanged ideas. Van der Lek was making paintings with big flat forms, like posters, with hard outlines and primary colors. Those colors evidently suggested something to Mondrian, and soon he was using them, as we're going to see in a moment. Mondrian had been using black lines and bars, which you've been seeing. Those suggested to van der Lek a way of further abstracting his outline drawings into line fragments, which is what you see in the middle. This composition, this one, marks a turning point for Mondrian. The changes he made to it between 1916 and 17 concentrated the energy and gave it more variety. You can see at the right, he squares off the ends of each of the black bars. He removes the potential confusion with Christmas trees and goalposts and ship's masts or whatever other familiar things might tempt us to see. He's right at the edge of the unrecognizable. And he's developing a rationale for stepping over that boundary into the fully abstract, into the absolute. For Mondrian, the absolute in art is embodied in the play of opposing forces, the balance between them. And he's testing the possibilities for shapes and colors and lines to be those opposing forces. He spent years seeking a spiritual purpose for his paintings, and now he's found it. It is to bring about an awakening in us viewers, to elevate and cleanse in the way music does without words. It's to help us shed our stale thoughts and habits and see things freshly, more deeply. Mondrian thought that if people did evolve in that direction, it would help not just them, individuals, but help even nations reform themselves in time, be less selfish and bloody-minded. Mondrian took on the role of theoretician. The little group around Laren grew to include 3 painters, a couple of architects, a sculptor, a composer, and a poet. We know from their letters that the painters debated the possibilities of a theory. Just how severe should that geometry be? Horizontals and verticals only? Really? No curves? No diagonals? What about colors? Only the 3 primaries? Or mixed, saturated, muted? One outcome was an agreement to get these ideas into print. The project would have a voice, a multilingual monthly called Stijl that began in 1917. And like most movements at the time, it published a manifesto. This one aimed at rousing artists of the world, including painters, sculptors, and architects, to join the struggle against selfishness and against despotism. Now, with a little editing, I've extracted 6 key points from the manifesto. 1, there's an old and a new consciousness of time. The old is connected with the individual. The new is connected with the universal. 2, the struggle of the individual against the universal is revealing itself in the world war, as well as in the art of the present day. 2, the war is destroying the old world. I'm going back now. Back. Excuse me a moment. Yes. The war is destroying the old world with its contents, individual dominance in every state. 3, the new art has brought forward what the new consciousness of time contains, a balance between the universal and the individual. 4, the new consciousness is prepared to realize the internal life as well as the external life. 5, traditions, dogmas, and the domination of the individual are opposed to this realization. 6, the artists of today have been driven the whole world over by the same consciousness, and therefore have taken part from an intellectual point of view in this war against domination of individual despotism. We therefore sympathize with all who work for the formation of an international unity in life, art, culture, either intellectually or materially. So this is fervent, vague, and it's general enough where art is concerned to allow a lot of different beliefs to coexist. And that combative tone, the words like abolition and annihilation, may sound a touch comical coming from pacifist painters in the Netherlands, which was neutral during the war, but that's the macho rhetoric of manifestos of the time. The movement was launched, it gained a following in the 1920s, and it put some respectable theory under the accelerating practices of abstract artists. Architecture, too. I'm going to have more to say about de Stijl in the last lecture. In Laren, Mondrian's struggles with his painting were in competition with his struggles to put his thought about art into words. His letters to his friends had sharpened his mind and kept it flexible, but to write for publication on the future of art in society was harder, and it shows. He was sometimes enigmatic or cryptic, especially where the spiritual was concerned. His first essay, Neoplasticism in Painting, came out in installments in de Stijl in 1917 and 1918. It promotes painting as a new, purer kind of art, superior to all other visual arts and a model for them. Music was limited by duration and by sound, architecture limited by practical functions, literature limited by words, which are ironically too specific. In Laren, he shared an attic for a while with his then-companion Maaike Middelkoop and her fiancé, the composer Jacob van Domselaar. Just how that arrangement worked hasn't been made clear, even by the wonderful biographer whose book has come out recently, Hans Janssen. He and Domselaar, however, debated whether abstract art could be a model for music, or vice versa. Domselaar was an admirer of Arnold Schoenberg, and he composed pieces of what we'd call minimalist pieces that confirmed for Mondrian the validity of his own principle for art, that it should be based on the vertical and horizontal elements. You may hear some similarity as you listen to a minute or so from a suite of short pieces by Domselaar called Examples of Style, played by their mutual friend Nelly van Doesburg, over on the right, a Dada poet and pianist. After he returned to Paris in 1919, Mondrian followed developments in contemporary music and dance, those things being inseparable in his mind, all through the 1920s. Wherever that led, including to some strange innovations, for a time, Mondrian was taken with the ideas of an Italian futurist painter called Luigi Russolo, who had written a treatise called The Art of Noises in 1916, about his invention of instruments that he called intona rumori, literally noise generators. He brought them together to form a mini orchestra of mechanical instruments, producing all kinds of noises. Players could vary in pitch the sound, the volume, and a lever that he was demonstrating at the bottom. Yes. That was a piece called Gogliatore, Gurgler. It was part of a program with the following offerings: screeching, creaking, rustling, buzzing, crackling, and scraping. So Russell abolished the old-fashioned individual musical stuff like virtuosity and beauty, and declared that manufactured noises like his would be the musical art of the future. Mondrian wrote that musical art today is seeking the amalgamation of the most dissonant, strange, and strident sounds. Mondrian said, "We are moving towards sound noise." For Rousselot's first performance in Paris in 1921, which caused a furor, Mondrian was there in the audience. His biographer Janssen wrote that he was probably sitting in the back row. The music that Mondrian actually loved was not avant-garde compositions of noise for the concert hall, but instead it was this: American jazz, boogie-woogie, which he could hear on records and live. This is Albert Ammons playing a boogie-woogie stomp in 1939. Well, Mondrian had this record. When he returned to Paris after the armistice in 1919, he discovered many discharged American soldiers playing jazz in the cafes. Mondrian had taken dancing lessons in Holland, although dancing in public was actually against the law in Holland until 1924. So he knew the basics, and he was ready to pick up the two-step and the foxtrot and the shimmy, and later on the Charleston. Several of these steps involved a lot of body contact between the dancers, unlike the waltzes of their parents' generations at arm's length. According to friends, Mondrian was enthusiastic and good at it. Here he is in his studio on the right, playing jazz records for an American visitor, the artist Gwen Lux. And here it is, again, is the product of Mondrian's studies in Laren for a purely abstract kind of painting in just black and white. And here it is in my mock-up, based on a photograph, of the installation that he called for in 1917 at an exhibition of contemporary art in Amsterdam. It's bracketed by, you can see that, by two smaller paintings that reintroduced color in the form of rectangular color planes that float on a white ground. They mostly keep separate, but here and there, some of them sort of park next to each other and form clusters. They mostly stay inside the frame, but at the top edges, several of the squares are cut off at the top, as though they went up and are in the act of disappearing, like figures ascending to heaven, like Dürer's Christ in the well-known woodcut of the Ascension 4 centuries earlier. Up close, you can see that there is a lot of paint laid on with great care. You can see that he pulls the thicker white paint up to the edge of the color planes, and there are many adjustments where the black bars end. In this self-portrait, he is impeccably dressed, and he seems wary, as though caught in the mischief of the painting behind him, which has only gray patches. He'd been working on a series of compositions with floating planes and lighter colors, all similar but not of equal size, and not quite lined up. In fact, placed with care, but only seemingly at random. They disappear at 3 of the edges, but not at the 4th, at the right. Again, you have to examine them up close to notice the painter's hand at work, the hand and brush making a lot of small adjustments. And irregular edges that keep reminding you that there's nothing mechanical about how this artist proceeds. It's intuitive. In the following year, Mondrian took another tack. He enlarged these color planes and fenced them in with gray lines. The overall effect seems improvised, or better, kind of syncopated, with some curious results. If you look at the corner at the upper left and the lower right, where smaller rectangles seem to huddle together, the color planes have been floating in white areas until now, and here they've gained status. Here those color planes have an identity of their own. And here we have the elements of Mondrian's mature works. Meanwhile, Mondrian was off in another direction. He's experimenting with square canvases on which he's painted diagonal grids on top of upright grids, superimposing them, and then hanging them with one corner down. It's possible that the idea grew out of debates with Bart van der Lek and Theo van Doesburg about whether diagonals logically belong in the vocabulary of their new stripped-down language of form. Mondrian wrote to Doesburg, "A while ago, I started a thing entirely in diamonds, like this. See my sketch. I have to find out if it's possible. Intellectually, I'm inclined to say it is. Perpendicular and flat lines can be seen everywhere in nature. By using a diagonal line, I would be canceling that out, but I'm inclined to say that this cannot be combined with the perpendicular and flat ones without different kinds of slanted lines." And he illustrated that in a little sketch there at the bottom, rotated, you can see, to a 45-degree tilt. Well, out of this came 4 paintings that were intended to hang in that way, one corner down. And this was something novel at the time. It set up an intriguing combination of challenges to traditional ideas of balance. The diamond shape itself was not new. Mondrian would have known that from memorial tablets there with inscriptions that hang in Dutch Calvinist churches. That's a footnote, not a claim for influence. And at the right, Braque had composed a still life in a diamond format that Mondrian might just have seen. This disagreement over diagonals turned out, amazingly, to be an issue of dogma for Mondrian. It precipitated a break, a break in his relationship and friendship with Doesburg. Here's a variation. He paints color planes over a grid that's oriented differently by 45 degrees. If you look close there, you can see the grid through the darker designs above it. The first diamond paintings were a bit of a detour from the main direction of Mondrian's development, but we'll be back to them because he made more. Meanwhile, there's another application for the regular grid of rectangles. It's a big leap. Here, a grid of 16 by 16 identical units, not square, but oblong, little blocks separated by fine lines, very carefully painted. Mondrian's design and color results from his clustering blocks of the same colors into groups of 2, 3, and 4, making a kind of vestige of a central vertical spine of whites and grays. Now, a dramatic variant. Same format, a companion piece that he exhibited together with the light-colored one you just saw. The paint here is dark and glossy, and the edges reflect points of light. This was a surprising allusion to something that he's seen in nature, which at this point, Mondrian, you'll remember, had renounced representing. His friend Duisberg learned this in a letter that Mondrian sent him. I do agree with you that the destruction of the natural and its reconstruction must be accomplished according to a spiritual image, but I believe we should take the broad view here. What is natural doesn't have to be a representation of something. I'm now working on a thing that is a reconstruction of a starry sky from nature. Someone who says he uses a theme from nature can be right, but also someone who says he uses nothing at all. These grids were evidently the last thing he did in Holland before he returned to a very different post-war Paris in 1919. Mondrian resettled quickly in his old studio in Montparnasse, and he took another tack, this time back to the picture of a year before that we saw a moment ago. We see on the screen now large forms separated by thicker lines that form a kind of armature or structure, not modular, but varying from one painting to the next. And here again, it's a kind of playful board game with no obvious system, where only a few of the edges line up, and there aren't any straight-through lines. In other words, there's no grid of equal intervals. Here, the form, in these two paintings, the forms vary in proportion and size and in color saturation. At the right, muted. At the left, more emphatic. The lines between the color blocks are still narrow, like mullions in a glass window. And here and there, the lines don't reach the edge of the picture, but they stop short. Mondrian clarifies the formula, and the picture on the right-hand side, this painting, just 2 feet wide, fills his prescription for dynamic equilibrium, the essence of what he's after. Primary colors, plus black and white, horizontal and vertical lines. But now the lines are wider, and they don't just separate the block, they seem to support the blocks. And yet, most of them still don't extend all the way to the edges. And when I use the word support, I realize there's no actual weight to support. This support is virtual, supporting visual weight. For Mondrian, that sensation of weight is a key element in the game of balance and equilibrium that he's setting out for us. Just observe how it works here. There's a horizontal line, or a bar, near the bottom, running almost all the way across. It just stops a tiny bit short of the edges. That suggests that maybe the bar supports everything above it by cantilevering, but that idea is defeated when you see that the two little legs that seem to be supporting it don't reach the edge at all. They stop. They're floating. There are other frustrations if we're trying to see a logical structure here. You take the red zone at the left. The bars at the top and the bottom stop before they get to the edge, and the red keeps going right out of the picture. How far? Who knows? The same with the yellow at the top. This is destabilizing. We'll see how this ambiguous play of bars with the edges works in many more pictures. At first, it looks structurally logical, but it's not. It reminds us that painting doesn't represent anything. It has other functions, though. What looks modular, heights and widths that are the multiples of each other, is actually improvised. It's eyeballed. The light gray square near the middle of this picture isn't just prominent, it introduces the suggestion of rotation, that the rectangles on its periphery might just cause the whole works to shift clockwise, unless they were kept stable. I want to show you a painting of a little earlier, I should say, that Mondrian repainted 5 years later. It reveals how he was thinking, or how he would say he was evolving. Luckily, I can do that because last fall I had some time in Basel with the conservator who made a study of this painting, Friederike Steckling. She took us through her findings. The spectator there with the camera is my daughter, Ann Walsh, who's an artist and teacher at Berkeley and was my companion and driver last week on a sort of Mondrian, last year, on a sort of Mondrian safari. You're going to see her again a few times. Among other things, Friederike had reconstructed just how Mondrian painted his black lines without a straight edge, and she helped us see how much experiment and correction he put into getting the widths and opacity of the black lines exactly right. Different kinds of light in the lab reveal things that you can't otherwise see. The big one here was what infrared light revealed on the left-hand side of the painting, what it revealed of what's underneath the red layer, a grid drawn in pencil. And when they extended the pattern of that grid digitally across the whole design, it corresponded to the verticals and the horizontals of the painting almost exactly. So Mondrian drew the grid and stuck to it most of the time in the painting, just as he'd done with the checkerboard paintings a few years before. But soon he didn't need the grid. Much of the picture was overpainted, also in 2 more phases. And after each phase, Mondrian signed the painting before it was exhibited. It was quite an accumulation of paint, and the paint cured during those years and made a rich pattern of drying cracks that you can notice in normal light even if you try. But in raking light, it shows us an essentially, really especially interesting surface, which mostly disappears again in gallery light. The research in Basel turned up more. In the microscope, you can see how Mondrian made many changes, especially in the black lines. They begin narrower, and then he makes them wider. In this case, they stayed wide. He changed the color of the blocks too, sometimes dramatically. The long greenish-blue rectangle at the far right of the painting started off red. You can see it underneath this damaged spot. In other places, yellows were originally gray, reds were orange. The net effect was to replace milder, muted colors with strong primaries, which became the classic formula Mondrian had arrived at by 1925. And what this case demonstrates is not just how finicky Mondrian was, but these years were ones of casting off the grid and moving towards a greater freedom and clarity. Throughout the 1920s and 38, Mondrian worked with very few interruptions on the works that we know him best for. Various arrangements of colored blocks and black lines, the formula he firmly believed would best enact true nature of the world. It would reconcile opposites by bringing them into balance, dynamic, not static. Digital images like this on a screen, though, are apt to falsify something else. The important fact that Mondrian didn't theorize about, that he made paintings by hand And he made objects made of paint and cloth and wood with the utmost attention, not just to their form, which you could just as well capture with a poster, but to the textures of the canvas and the character of the lines and the sheen and the relief of the paint surfaces. You've seen his hand at work just now, even in the photos. Here's another demonstration, I think, that may offer you as an advertisement for going to look at the real thing. The image you saw a few moments ago is a good digital file that you can download. And so this one, made of a painting in Dallas, made by the museum in good, even studio light. Here is a painting of the same year at the Metropolitan, a little smaller, photographed by a visitor, me, in its usual gallery aspect. The light is warmer, and it's under plexiglass in a shadow box with shadows. I'm going to crop all that out and get closer to it, where I think you can see the paint textures, and in the left-hand image, the slightly lipped-up edges of the blue paint as it meets the lines unevenly. And at the bottom, the shadow of the black line under the blue paint, revealing that he changed his mind. He had it down to the edge and then painted it out with gray. And you notice that they use similar devices of composition. In the Dallas painting, there's a massive block of blue in the upper right. Black lines partly define or confine the three color blocks, but they let them go off to the edge to who knows where. Mondrian gets things in balance by cantilevering the black block at the lower left, which in turn seems to be gripping a red block like a hot ingot. Does the whole structure rest on the bottom? Well, no. Again, it seems to be suspended with two legs of different lengths that don't reach the edge. It seems to float. Mondrian tried out vertical formats too. It took a few years for him to settle on pure primaries, blue, yellow, red. Before that, he experimented with mixed colors, like this orangey red and these various blues. And at the very far right top, a rich yellow layered over gray and applied in long vertical strokes that we can easily see. Mondrian also paid a lot of attention to frames. Here he's trying out colors for his strip frames, the bluish gray that he applied to the wooden strip, which is set back a bit, and also to the projecting edges of the canvas so that there's no mistaking where the design ends. Soon he's going to work out a better solution for this. Here, the three primary colors are dispersed in narrow oblong bars in a composition dominated by blocks of various shades of gray. There's a large square with the bar at the far right, visually thickened by a stripe of blue. And again, the arrangement suggests that a possibility of a tilt to the right or even rotation. But again, there's a counterweight, this time the red block held aloft on the upper left by a kind of lever arm in the upper left corner. The whole composition has something precarious and even witty about it. The painting in the Museum of Modern Art of the same year has a different equilibrium. There's a long vertical bar near the center, running top to bottom. On either side of it, the large dark blue shape at the left is offset by the array at the right, a big gray block with red above and yellow down at the bottom. That little yellow square down in the corner has an odd relation to the black box next to it, seeming to be in its grip, even being bitten. I'm guessing that Mondrian put that little bit in there to make us smile. Here's another red block held up high. This one has an ambiguous relation to the black bars that seem to support it and to space. It's a tease. Again, at the very top, it appears to be underneath the black bar, and logically, therefore, underneath it for its whole length. At the bottom of the red block, the horizontal black bar looks like a shadow cast by the red block. Mondrian may have eliminated illusions of space, but he can always flirt with them. And he can invite us to question our expectations. That big, empty square is not quite in the center. It sets up another imbalance that he corrects. And another thing, the square that looked white is actually a very pale gray. The true whites are at the top right and at the left in the middle. So far I've been moving all too fast and doing all the work besides. So I want to propose that we slow down for a few minutes for an exercise, a game. Now I'm showing you two images of the same painting by Mondrian. I want you to study them and decide which one you prefer, A or B, bearing in mind that Mondrian had the intention of creating dynamic equilibrium, something that was not static but stable. So first I'll show you A, and then B, and then together, and then I'll repeat that sequence. So just look, take your time, but I will ask you at the end what you prefer. So here's A. And B. Both. Last time. Now, simple poll, no prizes, no penalties either. Just a question. Which do you prefer? If you would, please, if you prefer A, put up your hand, please. Okay, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Okay, and B. Wow. I think it's B by a hair, but it's a horribly close election. If you have no preference, put your hand up now. Oh, aren't you great? Okay. Actually, Mondrian meant us to see A. Yeah. For the game, I turned it. For the game, I turned it upside down and I removed the monogram in order to make B. That is Mondrian's monogram. So I've done what Mondrian actually apparently did in the studio himself from time to time. To try out a composition by turning it in several directions on an easel. If you preferred B, you may have remembered something like it that I showed you before. The picture in Toledo, here it is again, with the red at the top corner. But Mondrian was actually trying something different in A, the Guggenheim painting. He was loading the top right corner with that black rectangle, and across from it, at the top left corner, he was letting the black horizontal bar pull away from the edge and just hang there, suggesting that the whole structure could potentially be pulled away to the right. And he puts the fiery red patch down in the corner where you might associate it with magma or a basement furnace. I should say right away that Mondrian wanted us not to see images of things in the real world that we know, but he didn't warn us against visual associations, which I think he considered legitimate as well as inevitable. And I want to step back for just a couple of moments and look again at Mondrian's own distinctive format, the diamond, which we saw him inventing before he returned to Paris. He brought some of those with him on the train. Here's his studio in Paris, and two of those compositions hanging high, points down. This format was obviously going to challenge an artist looking to create balanced compositions, and that was the point for Mondrian. Here, a couple of years later, he uses it with his new trademark primary colors. The grid is gone, and instead of mathematically determined relationships, there are black bars placed intuitively that contain large forms. What's also new is the way the four edges of the canvas cut diagonally into the composition and create odd polygons, the blue at the right and white in three places on the periphery. He achieves balance with that long horizontal bar above the center, again placed intuitively. You notice that the bars reach the edge of the canvas, they're squared off, and they touch it at only one point. So we're not to think that they might be fragments of some larger forms continuing into the space beyond. And that has the effect of detaching the design and giving it independence. He makes an exception for the blue shape at the far right, the place where a squared off bar would leave a teeny but conspicuous white patch. The little red triangle at the lower left, you'll see, becomes a familiar player in Mondrian's sort of rep company of forms. A few years later comes a bigger diamond painting at the left with a layout that's basically similar. The black bars are more prominent, and now they differ in width. The almost square rectangle in the upper right is the only complete form around which the sliced off colored triangles seem almost to rotate. The black form at the bottom supplies weight, a kind of ballast that helps stabilize the whole works. Along the four diagonal edges, there's no more play with the squared off black bars. Those are neatly cut off so that we can imagine the bars continuing outside as part of some larger composition. Another diamond with an even bigger squarish form, pushed a little off center and inviting a test of weight on either side. The black triangle on the left versus the pale blue complex at the right that's split by a heavy black vertical. It's an ambitious composition inviting you to speculate about what might lie beyond the diamond frame and whether you could judge it, whether you could figure out whether it was going to be more satisfying than what's left. I'm not sure you can. It's interesting also to see the play between a diamond canvas and a rectangular one, like our friend painting A, where the big, almost square coexists with a margin all around that carries all the colors. It's stable on its base, despite being detached at the top and bottom, and despite the pull that's exerted around it. I've been speaking about these images once again as though they were posters with no subtlety of paint and texture. I want to show you two details here of the right side of the Guggenheim painting that show you just how meticulous he was. At the bottom, how that black horizontal strut at the corner sits on the red patch, letting red come up halfway at the side, and how at the bottom, next to his monogram, just a couple of inches away, after changing and overpainting, he let a little red out. Whether there is a distinction without a difference here, I don't know. But it does show that he gave that question thought. In the detail at the top, here you see that he adjusted the width of the black bar to give it more weight. There were more diamonds in the years to come. We have a drawing that shows Mondrian experimenting with something even more radical, a diamond composition that would be open at the top. Here's one of those. I'm actually showing you two images of it because both are fairly bad, but you get the idea of it. Mondrian referred to this picture as an abstract surrogate of the whole. fairly typical Mondrian this isn't exactly clear, but I think he meant a kind of summary or epitome of his whole project as a painter in these works. His next move was to reduce the composition to just 2 lines and a tiny patch of blue. The horizontal and vertical, a pair of opposites, which, when he brings them into dynamic equilibrium, he proclaims as the irreducible essence of the world. And we do feel that we're looking at a mystery, this square on a point. These 2 lines, slightly unequal in length and width, and this bit of dark counterweight, blue, representative maybe of the primary colors, and maybe not incidentally, the color of sea and sky. When we come back together for the 3rd lecture, we'll start here, and we'll explore how Mondrian achieves the dynamic equilibrium in the remaining dozen years of his career. May you all have dynamic equilibrium in the time between now and then. Thank you very much.